and I'm joined in the studio by the Bristol Tree Forum's John Tarlton and also Vassili Papastavrouw. Did I do that right? Vassili, I've met you before, haven't I? I met you once quite recently, actually, looking at planning in the city. So what does the Tree Forum, what is it all about?
Well, everyone loves trees, except in a city there's there's basically a competition for space, and developers don't really love trees because they get in the way of big developments. So what we're seeing in Bristol is when each big development appears, all the trees on the site get it. And we're seeing a sort of hollowing out of Bristol where all the big trees in the middle of Bristol are being chopped down, and we have vague promises of replacements being planted. But actually, all that really happens is the money gets put in the bank in a Bristol City Council bank account, and very few trees are actually planted. And if they're planted, they're trees that will never become large. So enjoy the big trees of Bristol while you still can, because in the centre of Bristol, they're not going to be around for much longer.
John, can you talk about the Tree Forum itself, how you got started with that and what's the point?
Yes, well, the Tree Forum started, I think, around about 2007, something like that. I've been part of the Tree Forum for about 16 years, so I think I joined a couple of years after it actually started. Vassili was actually one of the founder members, so he's probably better to talk about why it started, but my understanding was that at the time, those trees that were planted for plant a tree in 73 became under threat because Bristol City Council did a survey of those trees. And as a result of tree surveys, very often what happens is people identify the problems with the trees and decide they need to be chopped down. So I think the Bristol Tree Forum started as a response to that, and we've been trying to save trees ever since.
What about the ash? A lot of ash are having to come down, aren't they?
Yes. So the ash is a very real problem. It's ash dieback, and it structurally weakens the trees, and it's an imported disease. We're very, very poor on our biosecurity in this country. So if you take a country like Iceland, they're incredibly careful about what they allow in and out of the country. But in our case, we've got not just ash dieback, but a whole range of other tree diseases coming in. And the real worry with ash dieback is it makes the tree dramatically unsafe, so that basically you might be standing under it and a whole branch just drops on your head or the tree falls over. So unfortunately, we're going to see a very big change in the countryside with many ash trees going. But actually, in the centre of Bristol, they're not the tree that's predominantly there that was planted by the Victorians and later by
so this is mainly a problem for country woodlands and things like that. I mean, I remember one of the walks I regularly go on, not far from, where is it? In between Stroud and Dursley area somewhere. There's loads and loads of ash have been cut back a couple of years ago, and you can see actually the new shoots coming up, and you look and you think, well, maybe that's going to know. Apparently they don't. They'll do another 4 or 5 years and then they'll start dying back too. So this is a serious problem. I had a chat to Robin Maynard about this, who's, I think he was ex-Friends of the Earth. He was doing Population Watch, which is a pretty awful thing to have been doing, but he was doing it anyway. And he said, well, the Woodland Trust introduced ash dieback because they brought in seedlings from Holland that they had been told were grown in Holland, but they weren't actually. They were from somewhere in Asia, and because they thought that it was okay to bring them from Holland, and they weren't actually really from Holland, they brought this disease in with them. But of course, the Woodland Trust are the last people in the world that would like to really admit to having brought ash dieback to Britain. So this is really Robin's story, but I mean, he's in a position to know about these kinds of things, and so I think that's feasible.
One thing I was going to say was the ash dieback is really going to hit a lot of trees in this country, but they think around about 5% of them are possibly resistant to the disease. So it is important that if actually you do have an ash tree that isn't looking as though it's got ash dieback, that you should be retaining it, because it seems that those that are resistant will pass on their resistance to their offspring. So
brilliant. Well,
any saplings that come out as a result of a resistant tree are also likely to be resistant.
What about, Dutch elm is a funny one as well, isn't it? Because that was when I was a kid. I can remember, and I've told this story a few times, we as, I suppose we'd be about 7, 8 years old or something, we were stood there completely silent. The kids were normally raucous, making loads of racket, we always did. But as these two elms were being sawn down on our piece of land, we used to play around as kids. All the children were silent. We watched these two trees come down, and actually just about every single elm was felled by that. But then we found there was a few in Brighton, and actually the Queen had her own elm tree, which had survived very, very happily. I'm not sure if it was in Windsor or Sandringham, one of these places, but purely because every time there was a sign of decay on the tree, that the tree surgeons had come in, clipped it off, taken it out, burnt it, and got rid of it, and so that elm tree survive fine. So there are ways of dealing with this. It's just that, it's lots and lots and lots of manpower involved in trying to do that to a whole load of ash. But anyway, so the big development going on at the moment in Bristol has got to be the St Mary Le Port possible development. It looks actually as if it's becoming potentially financially unviable and less likely. But can you say something about that? Because that's really, I won't use the word iconic. I hate people that do, but it is right in the middle of Bristol. It's the centre of Bristol. We had Joe Banks on here a couple of weeks ago talking about this development. It really is in the middle of the central park, where all people in the city centre sort of chip off there in their lunch breaks and sit and have a bit of relaxation in the summer, sit cross-legged on the grass and all that sort of thing. There's some beautiful mature trees around there that have grown up ever since it was bombed in World War II.
Yeah, well, there's a number of plane trees that surround the development site. Some of them are being retained, but we're going to be losing something like 10 mature plane trees, and these are big trees. It's also going to be losing a few smaller trees as well, which are probably of less consequence. But our argument had been all along is actually by just shifting the footprint of the building, they could actually retain all of those trees and wouldn't have to fell a single one. Of course, part of the planning process means that if you do fell a tree, you're supposed to replace that tree, and there's a calculation for how many trees should replace a single mature tree, because obviously when you plant a tree, it's a lot smaller. I think it's around about 50 odd trees are going to supposedly be planted in replacement, but as we found elsewhere, there's actually nowhere to plant them. So what happens instead is the developer pays a fee to the council, and the council put it into their bank account, and it sits there supposedly being used for replacement trees, but in reality actually it isn't. And there's it's edging towards about £1 million in the tree replacement budget that is unspent, simply because there's nowhere to plant the trees. And this is a particular problem in the city centre, where it's just absolutely chock-a-block. There's no space. Therefore, every tree that you should value very highly and not fell it in the first place.
Vassili, what do you make of this development? Would it, we just heard from John, it may have been possible just to have a different footprint of the buildings and not to be knocking these trees down?
Yeah, well, other local authorities do it. So in Islington, there's a case study of a very big building that's built quite close to some existing trees. And there, the local planning authority said right at the very beginning to the developer, we will only give you permission if you retain these trees. And they went to incredible lengths to build this huge building around the existing trees. And the result is spectacular. And in fact, we do have one or two examples in Bristol. One is actually not quite Bristol, but it's nearly Bristol. And it's the visitor centre for the suspension bridge. So it's on the far side of the bridge. And there's actually a cutout of the roof line of the building to accommodate branches of a tree that's right next to it. So here, the architects, or rather over there for the visitor centre, they'd actually decided to incorporate the tree into the design and retain the tree. But of course, it's much easier if you just flatten the entire site, remove everything, and you can get your big diggers in. You don't have to worry about anything. So essentially, it's all about profit. And if we've got a very hostile environment for trees in Bristol, and it's not at all like Islington, and as a result, developers know that they don't need to retain any trees on a development site.
So what we're really talking about is just shove a wad of cash to the council to stick in their special mega bank account, which, I mean, this sounds a little bit to me like this whole idea of carbon offset, where if you've done something, say for example, British Rail have to pay this, they're using some diesel or whatever, they're using something to propel their trains around, which is supposedly uses too much carbon, they can offset that by paying private equity firms to go and buy farmland and just plant trees. Now, this has actually annoyed the farmers quite a lot, because they're finding that it's almost impossible to it's been very pronounced in Wales, where local farmers just cannot buy land because land prices have gone through the roof because of this. So what do you make of this whole side of the carbon agenda, isn't it? I mean, some are very, very pro it. Some think it's really important to, and others think it's just some kind of scam.
So carbon offsetting, someone described it as committing a crime and paying someone else to go to jail for you. And it really doesn't solve the immediate problem, which is that a tree has gone in the middle of Bristol. And yes, we can plant a replacement on the outskirts of Bristol or somewhere else, but that's not going to bring any benefit to the middle of Bristol. And in the case of urban trees, we're not so much talking about carbon. We're talking about the fact that they're cooling the city in hot weather. They're providing amenity value for the people who live in the city. And of course, if you're planting replacements somewhere else, or in the case of Bristol, not planting them at all, obviously you gain no local benefit whatsoever.
Do you guys actually have any genuine involvement in planning applications? Do the council actually oblige to listen to you in any way at all?
Well, they're not obliged to listen to us, but we do contribute whenever there are any trees being lost. We will chip in and suggest to them alternative ways of doing things. And I think one of the things that we've come across again and again is whenever they talk about replacing trees, the reality is actually they just pay money to the council. And as Vassili says, it's the importance of trees in a city aren't just about the carbon sequestration, although you can have something like a large oak could be sequestering many tons of carbon. The main thing is the ecological services they provide, the cooling they get in heat waves, and the suggestion is that a single tree will perhaps cool the air immediately around it by as much as 10 degrees. So when you've got a really high temperature during a heat wave, having trees is really important. And there's a recent study found that in the eastern side of the United States, they wondered why it was that the temperatures hadn't risen quite as much as what had been expected. And lo and behold, they found out the reason for this is because lots of trees were planted over the last 50 years. So these trees are absolutely crucial. They reduce flooding, which is obviously an issue in cities. They reduce pollution by absorbing pollutants from the air. They reduce noise. So all of these things are just hugely beneficial, but hugely beneficial in the city centre more than anywhere else. And that's where we're losing the trees. And even though they may be replacing them, ultimately those replacements are going to be on the outskirts of Bristol, not where you need them.
Well, I can remember chatting with and being shown, this is with journalists at the Bristol Post, at the very top floor there where the executive suite was. There's a whole load of seagulls were moving in, and they found it very embarrassing when they're taking their guests out for a look across the city from the executive suite that they would be bombarded by seagulls, and if they weren't, they would be slipping over on seagull droppings everywhere. And I think they eventually got some sort of model of a hawk to sort of prop up to make it look as if the seagulls. But anyway, the fact is birds, really. Seagulls seem to get quite an easy ride in the city, but other birds that would be nesting in trees like the ones we're losing, we could be anyway in Castle Park, you know. So what about that bird life?
Well, yes, I mean, something like an oak tree is thought to support as many as 2,300 different species. So that includes birds, it includes invertebrates, fungi, mosses, bacteria, all sorts of things. A whole ecosystem can be supported by a tree. And of course, birds need to nest, and nests very often in trees. They will feed birds as well as other species that depend on the trees. But very often they actually create a corridor between green spaces within Bristol. You know, obviously we don't have green spaces all over Bristol, but those green spaces need to be connected, because otherwise in isolation they will just not be supporting anything. And trees are absolutely crucial in that, you know, not just birds but invertebrates and mammals as well. So I think the ecological importance of trees to nature generally, and you've got to remember the UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We need to increase our nature, and you know these things are all connected.
And the other thing not to forget is that people just like trees. And in National Tree Week last year, Bristol City Council decided to remove an iconic willow tree just by Temple Meads that was seen probably by thousands of people each day. And everyone went nuts about this because it was a lovely tree. They were removing it, having given themselves planning permission in a planning application that didn't mention the tree. So we weren't even aware it was happening. And it was decided as what's called a delegated decision. So it didn't even go to a planning committee. And so they thought, well, it wouldn't really matter. It's just a tree. We'll just chop it down. But they just didn't realise how much people loved the tree. And Bristol journalist Martin Booth happened to be cycling past while it was happening and videoed it being chopped down. And that was the start of a huge controversy, because suddenly the council realised that lots of people actually cared about this tree, which they felt had no value, so they could chop it down without a moment's thought. So people do actually like trees, and they have an aesthetic value.
Well, there is something quite symbolic about trees, isn't there? Just a sort of big symbol. I remember when that one on Hadrian's Wall was chopped down by somebody, people were getting very upset about that for no apparent reason other than we really do love trees. And there's also this sort of image in my mind of the happy, mature oak tree that's been neglected for decades, and it's getting more and more ivy up it until it reaches the point where a heavy fall of snow brings it down, you know, because the neglect, these trees do need to be managed, don't they? We must have thousands of them lining our streets around the city. And in a way, you know, you can see why the developers say, well, who cares about a few plane trees in Castle Park? You know, loads and loads of the suburbs of Bristol have got trees down every side of the road.
Well, I mean, one thing to remember about trees as well is the fact that the older they get, the more important they become for nature. A tree that you look at and might think it's a bit dilapidated, it's got some holes in it and broken branches and things like that, those are the ones that actually provide the greatest number of ecological niches for various species. So I think it's important to, as well as maintaining trees within cities, because obviously they have to be safe, that's the important thing, but as much as possible allow them to do what trees do, which is they do naturally.
Has the Tree Forum ever been listened to by Bristol City Council? I mean, it's a bit of an awkward question, maybe. I mean, obviously, you're putting in various submissions to these planning applications and things, but have they ever said, oh, actually, crikey, maybe we better save this tree?
Yes, I think we have had some successes. So, for example, in the early days of the Tree Forum, there was a plan to chop down lots of ancient and veteran trees on Redland Green. And through really quite a large-scale campaign, we were able to turn that around. But it actually took people outside Bristol, to well-known people who are outside Bristol, to come and look at the trees and then say to Bristol, look, you really need to think again about this. And we had to raised the money to commission reports to show that the trees were in fact not dangerous. We questioned the reports that the council themselves had produced, which were deeply flawed, which overestimated the risk by about 1,000 times the risk of death from the tree. And it was basically, it was a long campaign that we did eventually win.
Another recent example is the Ashley Down oak, which was a holm oak upon Ashley Down, an enormous tree, possibly hundreds of years old. We don't know exactly, but after a very long campaign, including people actually sitting in the tree, living in a tree house, eventually the council relented, and it was due to be felled because of supposed subsidence, but has now, that felling has been reversed, and the tree is doing very well.
Were you involved in the occupation of the tree, as it were, or is that not the sort of thing that your tree forum does?
We can get involved in that. We certainly did help out. I never actually slept in the tree overnight myself, but I did go along there and provide food for people that were in the tree. And for the M32 maples, that was another campaign where we also occupied the trees. Unfortunately, those trees are now gone. But again, we were very supportive of the campaign, and a lot of the time Bristol Tree Forum will provide technical help, advice and legal advice and so on. But we do get involved as well. We do get our hands dirty sometimes.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, this is like civic engagement as well as everything else, isn't it? Yeah. People seeing that by getting involved and doing things, changes can be made. Yeah. And then of course, networks are built up, and people, learn how to do this stuff. Because obviously a lot of our, the way people have to go to work and the consumer society we live in, it's very difficult to organise people. You need something to bring people together, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, and another example is the Baltic Wharf, which has now just become fairly live because after a pause of possibly a couple of years, the planning officer now going ahead and trying to put a planning application through for Baltic Wharf, where we're going to be losing around about 100 trees in one of the most tree-depleted areas of Bristol, which is around the docks. And again, a situation where they said they were going to replace those trees with 162 tree replacements, but there's only actually 2 places where they can plant trees. So there's going to be 160 trees that are not going to be replacing those trees that are lost. And that planning meeting is going to be happening, I think, on the 5th or the 6th of March, and we're going to be there and trying to stop it from happening.
Yeah, I can also remember, I think it's in Stow-on-the-Wold, going to the parish church there, and half of the main door, at the entranceway was a tree. It was a yew tree. A bit sort of quite Tolkien-esque, in fact, but the trees can actually be incorporated into buildings. Why on earth not? I suppose you might say, well, there'll be sort of little animals and bugs living in there. You don't want that in your living room. But this is supposed to be actually quite a trendy way of doing things. Why is it, do you think, that they're just considered to be in the way? It's in this latest case, for example, the one you're talking about at this forthcoming planning meeting. I mean, surely developers can see that there's an advantage to having, maybe if it's even making the bringing up the price of the buildings to have a few trees around. People, when they see that, they will be more likely to buy it, surely.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's be good if developers could actually take that approach, and that's one of the things we've been advocating for some time. Yeah. But of course, most developers, what they want to do is they want to have a completely clear site.
What, like sort of Gaza or something?
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, even better, they like to have green spaces, because then they don't have a building that then they need to demolish and move away. So somewhere like Baltic Wharf, which is basically an area just covered in trees, is ideal for them. But unfortunately, that involves them chopping all the trees down.
Yeah, I suppose the developers kind of constantly scoping around the city, aren't they? So, there's somewhere, maybe if there was a little fire in there, then it would be such a shame, where they'd have to condemn the building, and then we could move in and build loads of luxury flats. Isn't this what goes on in their minds?
Well, I think also it's not just in their minds. It's they're getting guidance from the planning officers. and there are lots of informal discussions before even a plan is drawn up. Yeah. And by the time you get to a planning committee, the planning officers are all co-opted. They're all there supporting the plan, saying it's a wonderful thing. They're telling the Development Control Committee members essentially to vote for it. And the opportunity to build something decent is lost. It was lost long ago. Whereas if the planning officers actually said at the very beginning, look, it's important for you to keep the trees, then of course they would do it.
But hang on, because actually here in Bristol we've got a particularly bad planning department. Now I would absolutely not single out any planning officer specifically, because I think a lot of them are, I mean, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't, because they do their best sometimes to uphold the planning regulations, and then they find that there are political and developer, sort of their toes get trodden on by these people. And then when they go along with what the developer wants, of course, the public will really dislike, and it's an almost impossible task when it's politicised, as it has been so much here in Bristol. And it's been fascinating to watch with the St Mary Laporte development, which may still, we know as of last week, may not go ahead because of the finances don't necessarily stack up anymore, and it's certainly not going to be started until the summer at the earliest. We know that what's happened is, through that process, many of the people in the planning department of various sorts who stood up and said, well, hang on, this is not appropriate, have been literally elbowed out.
And in some cases, the information they've produced was concealed. So looking at that development, looking at the tree information and looking at the various tree reports, the Bristol City Council Tree Planning Officer, who is very good, wrote a scathing report about the development, and it was actually withheld until the evening before the planning committee meeting. It was then quietly released, and the publication date was backdated to give the impression it had been there all along. So the planning committee weren't even aware of what their own tree officer had to say about the development. And then following the decision, it took us 6 months of freedom of information requests to get the full tree reports. And this is information that should have been out in the open.
Well, it sounds like you need a little army of eco-warriors to help you find that, not only doing freedom of information requests, but maybe lobbying those individuals who have been making such a mess. Now, look, the reason I came back in contact with you guys again is because of this allotment campaign. So I'd like you, one and then the other, to just talk about what you make of that, because there's some extraordinary rules to do with trees there, aren't there?
Well, the thing that I found incredible about it was the way a hornet's nest was stirred up in a way that, and the reaction to it was a meeting of 200 people within a few days of the first announcement, a massive WhatsApp group, people who are good technically at going through the accounts, brilliant artists, people who are good at dressing up and demonstrating, amazing placards, and basically you don't mess with allotmenteers. You know, they ran a fantastic campaign. And I think the issue was, once again, somebody in their bedroom drafted a policy on their own and thought it all sounded fine and did it without consulting with people. And we see this the whole time.
They probably did that knowing that we've got a mayoral system and whatever the mayor says goes. So if the mayor says, yeah, I like that, or no, I don't, but in this case, yeah, I do, then it happens.
Yeah, I think that is part of it. But I think where they got it wrong was people who have allotments feel a very strong connection to that bit of space, and they reacted incredibly strongly to it. And we'd love to see campaigns with that sort of strength on all the other issues that are facing Bristol at the moment.
Yeah, I think one of the issues to remember is the fact that the tree cover in the more socially deprived areas of Bristol is much less than it is in other parts of Bristol. So there's enormous inequality in the tree cover in Bristol.
Yeah, if you go up to Clifton and all around that area, up on the Downs, for example, trees everywhere.
Yeah, they've got about 25% tree canopy cover there.
Massive.
Whereas somewhere like St Paul's has got about 7%. And I think in somewhere like Clifton, people have the resources and the time to spend on campaigns, which may not happen in those parts of Bristol where people are just basically struggling to survive, and they don't have the time or the resources or the money to spend campaigning on these things. That's why it seems to be that in those most deprived areas of Bristol, we seem to be getting trees being lost all over the place, whereas those less deprived areas of Bristol, places like Clifton and Stoke Bishop and so on, you do lose trees, but generally speaking, the problem isn't as acute as it is in the more deprived areas.
Now, am I right in thinking, I think it was Mal Sainsbury we had on here a few weeks ago, she was talking about the council actually wanting people to chop trees down and charging people for them, this sort of thing? No?
Not come across that, no.
Having some sort of objection to trees is part of their the council's proposals. I don't know, maybe I hadn't seen that, I don't know.
I mean, in some cases trees can be inconvenient to the council, but I think generally speaking, certainly the tree officers and the people that we deal with at the council are very much in favour of trees, but it seems to be the emphasis is more on planting trees, which tends to be in the outskirts, and not so much on retaining trees in the city centre where we need them most.
How long do these sorts of mature plane trees on Castle Park, around that St Mary Le Port scheme, how long does it take them to get to maturity?
Well, you can get a pretty good idea by looking at the results of Plant a Tree in 73. And once you've got your eye in, you can wander around Bristol and identify all the trees, because they're all pretty much the same size. And what happened there was a New Zealander called Frank Kelf was employed by the council and was just basically allowed to run wild. And he managed to get a load of funding over a 2-year period and just planted trees everywhere. Plant a tree in 73, plant some more in 74. And so if you look, for example, outside the Arnolfini and look at the plane trees that are there, they'll give you exactly an idea of the size, and then you can start finding them everywhere, all over Bristol. So it's an incredible thing he did, and plane trees do grow fast, but it still takes 20, 30 years before they become substantial.
Yeah, one of the things that we've got on the Bristol Tree Forum website is a tree carbon calculator, and basically that's to tell us how long it would take for a tree that's been felled to be replaced by a tree that's just been planted. And generally speaking, it's in the region of 40 to 60 years to actually recover the services and the benefits that a tree has. And of course, you can replace a tree, but what you can't replace is the time that tree has taken to grow. And very often that could be 70, 80 years, or if you're talking about a very old oak, and there's certainly one up on the Downs that I'm very familiar with, which is probably around about 530 years old. So some of these trees are very old. And of course that is an enormously valuable tree, because it's a medieval tree. It's a medieval tree, yes. It was born around about the same time as Henry VIII.
Amazing that some of these things can carry on so long. In fact, I remember hearing about the yew tree, which is the most long-lived tree, that's why it was revered by the people in prehistoric society. Maybe you can say something about this, Martin. I don't know if you know anything about it at all, but being told on a site somewhere, I think it was on one of these hill forts, someone giving a guide saying the reason that you often find these planted in these sacred sites of various sorts and where humans were living back in those days is because they understood through various generations that these things lasted long, long time, and so they revered them in some sort of way, at least probably more than Bristol City Council seem to. We've also got the ongoing situation with a hedgerow being dug up at Yew Tree Farm. I don't know if either of you have been following that. That's been in the news this week. Yes,
we've both been very much involved in that.
Please, tell us about what's going on. Why is it important?
Well, what's happened in Yew Tree Farm is completely shocking. We've had, over the years, apparent political support for the retention of Bristol's last working farm, but due to some really bad decisions taken by the council, one of the nearby landowners basically has decided to remove a section of hedging, and despite the discovery of dormice, which are incredibly rare now, they're a highly protected species, the big machinery came in on probably one of the wettest days of the year, basically trashed the area all around the hedge, and the hedge itself was
hang on. These dormice don't sound very protected to me.
Well, they're only protected if a local authority gives them protection, and in this case, as usually happens, desperate phone calls were made, and no action was taken by the council, no action whatsoever. And it seems to us that that Redrow, who have an option on the land, are trying to degrade it to the extent that it no longer has any nature conservation value, and then they can argue it'll be fine to build houses on it.
So I suppose the idea is if we kill all the dormice, then there's no longer the chance of this being a wildlife or conservation area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that a site of nature conservation interest does, it protects a site from development, but it doesn't protect it from anything else. So the farmers that are managing it, and the previous farmer managed it so well that's why it actually acquired the status of a site of nature conservation interest. But unfortunately, she's been removed from that, and another farmer is taking it over. And it looks to me as though probably what is happening is that land is being degraded to the point at which it is no longer part of the site of nature conservation interest. It will no longer be attributed as such, and then the developers can move in.
Well, I mean, this is the council's land, isn't it?
Well, it's actually a complicated story. So, poor Yew Tree Farm is being attacked from one side by a commercial developer, and then on the other side, the council owns land which it had allowed Yew Tree Farm to use, but it's now expanding the cemetery and building lots of drainage pipes and what have you, again into an area of nature conservation interest, a site of nature conservation interest. And the cemetery proposal is flawed in all sorts of ways, partly because the land there is so wet and badly drained, but they're hoping to cure some of those problems by putting massive pipes into the ground and essentially losing some of the water into a stream nearby and putting attenuation ponds in and goodness knows what else. So they're turning a site of nature conservation interest into essentially an industrial area.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking. Your tree forum, if people are interested, do you meet face to face, or are you one of these sort of people that do Zoom meetings only and occasionally would turn up at a council planning meeting, that sort of thing? So how do you operate?
Well, we do meet face to face. We have a relatively small committee made up of maybe 6 or 7 people who meet on a regular basis. We have an AGM once a year where everyone is invited, and to be honest, for our standard meetings, if anyone wanted to come and join us, they're perfectly happy to do so. We'd be very happy to welcome them along.
Well, come on, okay. Now's the hard-nosed sales pitch. Why should people get involved?
They get involved because they value trees. We're here basically to promote trees, to promote tree planting, to help retain trees, to educate people as to the benefits of trees, and we get involved in the politics, we get involved in campaigns. So anybody who's interested in trees, who thinks that trees are a good idea, and I'm sure most people do, should get in touch. We have a website, Bristol Tree Forum website, and we also have a sister website, which is the Trees of Bristol, which tells you everything you would ever want to know about pretty much every tree in Bristol. So go on to the website, but certainly get in touch with us, and if you want to be involved, we'd be happy for you to do so.
Okay, Vassili Papastavrouw and John Tarlton from Bristol Tree Forum, thanks ever so much for joining us, and also sharing your contact details and all that sort of thing, because I think it's just so wonderful that people like you are prepared to give your time up for something so important, which is something that the developers and many of the people at the City Council, at the top anyway, don't really seem to give a damn about. Martin, we're going to now go on and talk a bit about the shenanigans in Parliament this week, and on Wednesday there was supposed to be a...